Today's topic is your personal writing process. If you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you hone your own personal process. So if you look up writing process online, you're probably going to come up with some variation of pre-writing, writing, research, drafting, editing, polishing as the process of writing. But I'm not talking about that particular process today. I'm talking about a different kind of writing process. I'm talking about your process for getting the work done. I want to focus on that daily writing process that allows you to get from the beginning to the end of each writing session, and then from the beginning to the end of the book that you're writing as a result. It's that process that helps you to make the best use of the writing time that you have available. So today I'm going to give you some tips for finding that process and using that process well, so that when somebody asks you, how do you write a book? You can tell them. You'll have an answer. Now, before I get to my tips, I just thought, in case you're wondering, my own process for writing fiction is to let the characters speak for themselves. I usually begin with a story idea, which I mull over until it becomes a story premise, and then I allow the characters to take over and begin talking to me. I come up with what I call clothespins. Those clothespins become parts of the story structure, which we talked about in the last video. But that is part of my process for writing on a daily basis. But it's also very different from the process that I used when I wrote nonfiction, which is where I began my writing career, as you all know if you've been watching me for a while. When I was writing nonfiction, my process was very different on a daily basis, but in an overall way it was too, because it was very structured and very outlined. Because I was selling to publishers, and publishers needed that kind of structure before they would buy a book, before they would offer a contract. But the daily approach to how you get the work done is what we're really focused in on today. Tip number 1, don't try to emulate another writer's process. I might share with you some notions of how I get it done, or you might look it up on the internet and find out what's Stephen King's process on a daily basis. How does he get to his word count on a daily basis? Those are other writers' processes. You're going to have to find your own. So that's my first tip, is make sure you begin to see this as something that's going to be unique for you. Tip number 2, find a ritual. I've talked about this before when we've talked about momentum in your work. Find something that you do before you sit down and write every day. If you play the piano, play a piece on the piano. Play the same piece on the piano every time. Play something on your guitar. Do some yoga. Have a cup of coffee that you sit in a particular place and you drink that coffee, and you drink it all before you actually sit down. Go for a 10-minute walk. Whatever you do, do it every single day, and by the time you have come to the end of that ritual, the end of the piece of the piano, the end of your 10-minute yoga session, you know that you're in the mindset for beginning to sit down and start writing. Tip number 3, divide your writing time from your editing time. One of the best ways to power through your writing is to just ignore the editing and get it done. So maybe think of it this way. Think that on one shoulder you have your tiny little writer, and on your other shoulder you have your tiny editor. And what I'm going to suggest you do when you sit down, after you've finished your ritual, you flick away that editor on your shoulder and just allow the writer to take over for that moment. Tip number 4, figure out where you're going to end each session. What I mean by this is, are you going to end it in the middle of a sentence? Are you going to end it in the middle of a paragraph? Are you thinking about ending it at the end of a chapter? I will write to the end of this chapter and then I will finish. I'm going to suggest to you that the end of a chapter is probably not the ideal place to finish a writing session. But if that's something that allows you to parcel out the writing, finish that chapter, but start the next chapter before you get up. Go to the next chapter, put the next chapter number or name, whatever you're using, and write at least the first half of the first paragraph, so that when you sit down the next day, you can pick up where you left off. Part of my own process is that I begin each writing session by reading what I wrote the day before and doing a light edit. How do I know what I wrote the day before? Because I keep a record of it in a date book, so that each session, when I sit down, I know exactly where I'm going to start. And when I finish that light edit, get to the end of that section, I just carry on writing as if that's where I was. Tip number 5, find your own personal happy place for your word count for the day. Now, there are many arguments for and against using word counts to propel you forward, but I'm going to suggest to you, particularly as you're beginning to find your own writing process, that you find a comfortable daily word count. Now, it's not something that you must do every day, but it's a guideline for you. And I'm going to suggest that you set a minimum, and I'm going to suggest that the minimum be no less than 250 words. 250 words is really about the number of words that's on one page, double-spaced, if you have an 11-point type and you printed it out. But for most writers, that might be all that they have time for or the thought process for in a day. But if you at least set that as your minimum, you will get that done. Now, I'm going to suggest that you don't necessarily set a maximum, because some days you're going to keep on writing. Now, I have a word count that I set, which is kind of loose, at about 2,000 words a day. But I sometimes go over it, and sometimes I'm not quite there. But it does actually provide me with that guidance when I think I might be finished right now, I should get up, and I look and I see I've only written 1,500 words. Well, maybe I'm just going to sit here and see if I can carry on with this paragraph. And sometimes I end up writing more than 2,000 words, and sometimes a little less. But it does provide you with an incentive for continuing on and knowing where to end. Once you have a writing process, you can feel very comfortable that every writing session that you have is going to be productive in some way. I think this is really important, particularly if your time is limited. And let's face it, isn't all of our time limited in one way or another? Find your process. Happy writing.
Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills, 5 tips at a time.